Welcome. I'm Catherine Wessinger. I'm one of the co-general editors of Nova Religio, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Bernard Doherty. He is currently course director in the School of Theology and a research fellow for the Center of Public and Contextual Theology at Charles Sturt University, based at St. Mark's National Theological Centre in Canberra, Australia. He is also an adjunct lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Notre Dame, Sydney, and an honorary research fellow at Inform, Information Network focused on religious movements, based at King's College, London. Having previously worked at the Australian Catholic University, Macquarie University, and Baylor University, Dr. Doherty's key area of research is new religious movements in Australia and abroad. Welcome, Dr. Doherty. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Kathy.
Your article in the August 2020 issue of Nova Religio is titled "Strange Gods in a Great Southern Land, a Preliminary Survey of the Australian Cult Controversies 1960 to 2000. In the article, you discuss 4 waves of cult controversies in Australia. Please tell us about your article and the 4 waves of cult controversies.
So in this article, I took a look at sort of a bit of a synoptic look at what had been done on new religions in Australia. And I discovered that actually, while there'd been a few articles going back to the 1980s, there hadn't really been a synoptic kind of historical overview, particularly considering there's controversies going back to the 1850s, which I'll come back to later. But at least since the 1960s, what we'd refer to as modern cult controversies have flared up almost every decade since then, often more than once. And so I decided I'd look at a synoptic way, but I found it quite difficult. Like, how am I going to order all the data here rather than just telling a whole bunch of anecdotes of each of the different stories? And so I returned to a book I read many years ago, and one of the books that made me interested in the study of new religions, and that was Philip Jenkins's Mystics and Messiahs. And he looked at sort of different waves of cult controversy beginning sort of in the 1850s, I believe. It's been a while since I picked it up. And so I decided, you know what, like, this seems to fit with Australia, and the different periods had different sort of core themes where controversies over new religions overlap with wider societal concerns over various things. And so I originally identified 5 of these and then went back and realized that would be too much for an article. And as you know, Nova Religio were very generous with word limits on this one because I went very much over. And so I decided to cut it back by 10 years and just go from 1960 to 2000. And so I identified what I thought were 4 key sort of waves of cult controversy. The first of these was to do with what was then known as the Hubbard Association of Scientologists International. And they became particularly controversial in Melbourne, in Victoria, currently under lockdown with COVID-19, back in the 1960s. And this controversy had a lot to do with sort of Cold War concerns in Australia. Scientology managed to offend one by one major cultural institutions in Australia, from the Roman Catholic Church to the Australian Labor Party, et cetera, the media. And so eventually there was a parliamentary inquiry, or a parliamentary debate over it, and then what was known as a commission of inquiry, or a royal commission, by the state of Victoria, led by a man named Kevin Victor Anderson, who eventually became a Supreme Court judge in Victoria. And Kevin Anderson, basically the Anderson Report was published in 1965, and it starts off with the words, "Scientology is evil." And that sort of sums up basically the tone of the report, and I quoted a few times in the article, and I've written elsewhere on this. And so that became the first major controversy involving a new religion in Australia. Eventually Scientology was banned in 3 Australian states, in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. However, no one was ever prosecuted, successfully prosecuted under this legislation, though it stayed on the books in Victoria until 1982. Which I mentioned, I go through in the article. The second wave sort of works in more with what was happening internationally in the late 1960s, early 1970s, with the rise of the what is normally seen as the rise of the anti-cult movement in the United States and United Kingdom. And here I look particularly at groups like the Children of God, the Hare Krishnas, and a few local groups like a commune in Western Australia called the Universal Brotherhood. And they were kind of a syncretistic, theosophical, UFO. They mixed a lot of things together. Very interesting group. And they became controversial in the 70s. And you start to see concerns from overseas, and the original Citizens Freedom Associations and groups like that over in the United States started popping up in Australia, these grassroots parent groups. So I traced some of the history of their lobbying of government and what was involved there. And this also brought in the few cases of deprogramming in Australia, which had occurred. There's actually very few documented cases. As far as my research has shown, only 2 ever went to court, and no prosecution was maintained there. Though one case I talk about in the article was a very close call for a Catholic priest who was later told by his bishop, "You shall no longer be involved in deprogrammings." Mm-hmm. So the third wave was more in the 1980s. So by the end of the 1970s in Australia, the sort of concern that was coming from overseas had kind of petered out to a large extent. People had said, you know what, these groups aren't really doing much social harm. We don't really like what they believe. The churches found them upsetting because they were more successful in some cases in evangelizing people than some of the churches, which is always a bit of a boundary maintenance issue for them. But generally, there was a lot more tolerance. And in the early 1980s, the Church of Scientology won a major case in the High Court of Australia, which is our equivalent of the Supreme Court in the US, basically, which ever since has actually defined religion in Australian law and what constitutes a religion. And so after that, a lot of these groups were treated with a lot more tolerance and sort of respect. They were sort of let in the door. As far as I'm aware, only one group since has been denied the status of a religion in law, and that was a temporary case, and that involved the Raelians, and I won't go into that just yet. So in the 1980s, it started off relatively quiet, and some of the media in particular was a lot more friendly to new religions. But then there started to be the concerns over child abuse and the sort of the child saver movement, as it's called in America. Similar things started to occur in Australia. Child welfare became a particularly hot button political issue. And along with this, you had a group in Victoria, in sort of the rural hinterlands of Victoria, called The Family, not to be confused with the American Family, led by a woman called Anne Hamilton Byrne. Now, this group, through a series of illegal adoptions and a network of doctors and nurses, it's very intricate. Carol Cusack actually deals with this in some length in the issue of Nova Religio, and I recommend everyone read Carol's paper here. But essentially, this group adopted mass number of children and treated them abominably. The stories of abuse coming out of that for those children were just horrific. And so in 1987, Child Services in Victoria raided some of their properties and took the children out and made them wards of the state. But for some reason, I think it was largely because the children weren't considered, because they'd gone through so much abuse, it would have been incredibly traumatic to put them before the courts. They let them off. Basically didn't prosecute, I should say. And Anne Hamilton Byrne, her then husband, fled overseas to the Catskill Mountains in the US and lived sort of off the grid. And for years after, the media are like, where is Anne Hamilton Byrne and why hasn't this woman been brought to justice? And eventually she did come back, and they were actually prosecuted on some fraud charges and fined a large amount of money. But in terms of the accusations made against the group, particularly for child abuse, they got off very lightly. But this sort of re-alerted that these groups could possibly be abusing of children. And again, something in the early 90s, the same, there was raids on the Children of God in Australia, which were large. They seized, I think, about 130 children from 2 properties in Sydney and Melbourne. Eventually, it was found that there was no wrongdoing there, but it was a considerable controversy. This also overlapped with the wider international satanic panic. And most of the ideas from the US and the UK filtered over to Australia, often with sort of visiting. Mike Wardenke, for instance, the evangelical comedian, made several visits to Australia at the expense of Australian churches. I have several colleagues in theology who remember seeing Mike Wardenke as children, which is quite interesting. And a lot of other figures like Kurt Koch, the German sort of Lutheran demonologist, and others came to Australia and sort of brought a lot of these ideas with them. And it started, Australian concern over the occult started in the 60s as it did in the United States and United Kingdom, but it slowly built over the 70s and into the 80s. As these controversies blew up in the US, they quickly traveled to Australia and kind of blew up here. And again, the concern was about these sort of abuse of children and that kind of thing. We had several parliamentarians believe these ideas and brought them up in Parliament. And like in the US and the UK, we had investigations. So in New South Wales, there was a large royal commission into the police service in the 1990s known as the Wood Royal Commission, or the Inquisition, as they called it in the New South Wales Police Service. And this was basically into widespread police corruption and all kinds of accusations that had come out in Parliament. Now, because there were some claims that the police had covered up satanic ritual abuse, they actually investigated this. An entire chapter of this report, which is 4 volumes long, and it's devastating of what it has to say about New South Wales policing. But on the satanic ritual abuse thing, it says this has just been blown up by the media and there's like no evidence for this. So that sort of peters out in the early 90s, the sort of concern over children, though it does frequently pop back up episodically with sort of various groups, particularly groups that live communally. And in some cases, there's been established wrongdoing, and I'll come back to that. The 4th wave sort of ties up with the sort of last decade of the millennium, and as happened overseas, wider concerns about millennial groups and Y2K and anxieties there. And because Australia, there were several links between the Order of the Solar Temple, Religio, and also the Branch Davidians with Australia, several of the Branch Davidians, including
Clive Doyle.
Clive Doyle are actually Australians. And when I met Clive Doyle, we discovered that we support very opposite AFL teams. So, basically there were tangible Australian links here. And so the Australian intelligence services started to look into this, and this got publicised in journals. And then Waco happened. And this had already been taking place, but Waco took place, and suddenly it becomes sort of hot business, this sort of siege kind of thing, and this danger of doomsday cults. And suddenly you sort of see within a few months of Waco, there's Australian groups being accused of planning mass suicides and all kinds of things. But unlike overseas, where you've got a lot of these groups that are New Age apocalyptic groups like the Order of the Solar Temple, or kind of pre-millennialist or Adventist Protestant groups, the 2 groups that kind of feature here in Australia are both breakaway Roman Catholic sects. And they're both claiming, no, we're perfectly good Catholics. It's just our bishop's crazy and won't listen to us. And the Virgin Mary tells us that we're doing the right thing. And so these groups become really quite controversial. And on the one hand, the media is calling them a cult. On the other hand, the Catholic Church is like, they're not members of us, and they're trying to distance themselves from it, while these groups are claiming a Roman Catholic identity. And as they're getting more and more pilgrims, Roman Catholic pilgrims coming into their apparition sites, suddenly the church is like, we've got a real problem here. And eventually, and this is quite uncommon in the Catholic Church, they instituted official sort of canonical investigations into this. And both of them basically decided neither of these groups had any bona fides. They basically said both leaders were fraudulent and heretical. And at that stage, basically at least members of one of the groups all ended up mass excommunicated. And that remains in force up until today. So that sort of brought up to sort of the year 2000, and that was kind of the last wave. And then some further stuff happened after that, but that's where the article sort of ends off.
Well, yeah, that covers a lot. I have a lot of questions. You've mentioned the media, and so does the media play a significant role in hyping up fears of new religious movements or so-called cults?
I think in Australia it very much does. It's been, ever since the 1960s controversies over Scientology, it was a newspaper known as the Truth newspaper, which is sort of Australia's most notorious tabloid. There's recently, I discovered in a book shop the other day, I didn't purchase it, there's been a history written of this by one of their journalists. And he writes there's a considerable degree of embarrassment of having written for this newspaper. But they went after Scientology heavily, called them bunkumology. And for like months before the inquiry, they were writing sort of weekly articles, making fun of the group constantly until sort of, and raising any concerns. And so the media have always been a sort of an instigator here. And they've had a really checkered history. I mean, as far back as the early 1990s, Jim Richardson wrote a paper in the Journal of Contemporary Religion about journalistic bias against new religions in Australia. And he said that Australia then was 10 years behind the rest of the world in how it covered, its media covered new religions. And I hate to say it, but sort of 30 years on, things have not really improved. The same sort of narrative goes forth. That said, the media in Australia have also been, investigative journalists have been responsible not only for exposing groups when they're caught in wrongdoing or alleged wrongdoing, but they've also done a lot of sort of major sort of historical work on some of these groups. The problem is that as it's journalistic things, it tends to be filtered through a very anti-cult, brainwashing lens. It tends to downplay anything positive these groups have done. But at the same time, it sort of shaped the narrative and the sort of basic history of how we understand it. And as journalistic works, they're also badly referenced. So you find these fascinating anecdotes, but you can't find where they've got this claim from, this kind of thing. So there's a kind of a catch-22. There's been some good journalism on them and some good long-form journalism, or at least sort of well investigated, but it still tends to be filtered through this very anti-cult lens and fails to appreciate a lot of the wider societal causes of what's going on and why these things become controversial during the time that they do.
Well, I mean, you've gone over, 4 waves of cult controversies, but I'm wondering also about any possible new religious movements in Australia that do not receive controversy, that may be seen as benign or just part of the Australian religious landscape. Are there religious movements like that, or that fall into that category?
I think that the Hare Krishnas would be a good example here. Now, they begin very controversially in the 60s and 70s, but by the 80s, they're just seen as a kind of fixture and everyone sees them as quite benign. And that sort of everyone loves going to Govinda's, the Hare Krishna restaurant in Sydney and Melbourne. They have these vegetarian restaurants and they're just seen as kind of an expression of the Australian counterculture. And so they were seen as relatively benign relatively quickly. But most other groups have not attained that. Scientology has kind of legally forced its way into being sort of accepted publicly, and they proactively go to religious freedom events and try and network with other religious groups. They've been major players in bringing together new religions in coalitions to resist kind of oppression, as they'd say it. But generally, they're still treated very suspiciously in these things. So yeah, other than the Hare Krishnas, I can't really think of a group off the top of my head that sort of functions that way.
Actually, I'm curious to hear the names of the 2 Marion Apparition groups that were so controversial.
So one was the Magnificat Meal movement, and that was based in a place called Helidon, which is a small town outside it's in the Diocese of Toowoomba, which is in Queensland. And so very small sort of town. And yep, that's where they popped up. And their leader was a woman named Deborah Burslem. She's still alive. She lives in Vanuatu now. And the other group was known as the Order of Saint Charbel. And they popped up in a place called Canberra, which is part of a wider region normally referred to as Nowra. So in newspapers, they say, oh, the group's from Nowra. And I've referred to that in an article, but they're actually from a small little town outside Nowra called Canberra. And they were founded by a man named William Calm, who spent, he was eventually convicted on child sex offences and spent a considerable time in jail until recently. And yeah, they were the far more controversial of the 2 groups, I'd say.
Over the child sex abuse charges, or any theological issues?
I think generally, I mean, theologically, these groups, they're not theological innovators. They're very much out of the wider kind of culture of apparition groups, Marion Apparitions groups more generally, the kind of stuff that Joseph Laycock, your fellow editor, has written on with the Seer of Bayside, and Nova Religio did a very good special issue a few years ago on this. So they very much come out, they're not theological innovators, but a lot of their ideas were quite conspiratorial. They were critical of the local hierarchy, which is where there was clashes, and claimed that the local hierarchy were in cahoots with the Freemasons, and a lot of sort of stuff that's in conservative Roman Catholic circles has existed since the 19th century. And most people these days realise it's kind of conspiracy theory nonsense, but it sort of took a hold in certain periods. I mean, the Order of Saint Charbel in particular, they pop up in the early 1980s for the first time, right at the end of sort of the Reagan era, and they're kind of these sort of the evil empire fears, and they have these anti-communist themes and this kind of thing. So they found an appeal there, and they particularly appealed amongst migrants. We had a lot of, after World War II, large numbers of Eastern and Southern Europeans came to Australia, migrated to Australia. We finally, like in America before World War II, we had quite restrictive immigration, what is known to our national embarrassment as the White Australia policy, which favoured Anglo-Irish kind of migration. After World War II, that started to be lifted. You had a lot more Italians, Poles, Croats all come in, and a lot of these people are incredibly devout Roman Catholics, but they also have a deep Marian piety. And so this really took off with those kind of people, because they've kind of found they were doing these big Marian processions and praying the rosary. And you can still go to events held by, approved events held by the diocese in which the Order of St. Charbel popped up, in which it's essentially, I jokingly called it ethnic picnic day, because you have huge like national groups of Filipinos, Poles, Croats all coming there with their national flags, and they all have a shrine. They all have a separate shrine to the Virgin Mary in this particular site, and they all go to mass, and then they'll parade around the site carrying the monstrance, and it's quite an amazing sort of thing. And this happens on a monthly basis during the year. So this is a kind of population it came out of.
Yeah, sort of an ethnic immigrant new religious movement to some extent.
And it's and that was something that the newspapers initially caught on to. One of the earlier, more detailed reports on the group caught on to this and commented on it. But then after that, they quickly, just after Waco, they became transformed into the kind of the standard Doomsday Cult. This kind of image of this, and suddenly their kind of Roman Catholic moorings just get taken out of the picture, and it sort of really, I think it actually creates much greater alienation between the group and their diocese, and made any kind of reconciliation impossible.
You've mentioned the Branch Davidians a couple of times, or that whole incident in Waco in 1993, or outside Waco, I should say. But so I gather from your remarks that, quote, Waco was a watershed moment in terms of depictions of unconventional religions in Australia. Is that correct?
I think so. Before that, like, academics knew about the Church of Scientology thing and a few people, but generally there'd been a few localized controversies over in Western Australia. The Rajneeshis had a controversy in the city of Fremantle, and then in a small town about 80 kilometres south of Canberra, and this place is tiny, it's called Durangle, the Unification Church set up a recruitment centre in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and ran into a big controversy with the local sort of community down there. They eventually sold it off, but there's a whole history written in the newspaper of the time about this localized controversy. So you had localized things, but really it was the Branch Davidian controversy outside Waco that really blew things into a thing. And you had it for the first time an Australian politician bringing it into the parliament. In this case, it was the New South Wales Parliament. A politician named Stephen Much, and he brought it in and sort of raised and said, we need to investigate cults in New South Wales, and this is the first time it happens. And after that, it becomes a template, which a lot of groups for the next 10 years at least are kind of referred to by this rubric.
That's interesting. And has that rubric sort of disappeared a little bit, or is people are less concerned?
After the turn of the millennium, millennialist groups were no longer they were passe, as it were, in Australia. And I mean, the controversies after that, particularly sort of from the mid-2000s, actually revolved, and this is what I had to leave out of the article, revolved around groups getting involved in politics, and particularly a group known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, or the Exclusive Brethren, kind of the more conservative wing of the wider Plymouth Brethren movement. Their leadership is based in Australia, and in the mid-2000s, it was discovered that large amounts of third-party political funding were being used for sort of advertising in support of the conservative, then incumbent conservative government, and that these had been funded by the Exclusive Brethren, which would have been not a problem, except that the Exclusive Brethren don't vote. They conscientiously object to voting. So, and also they had a reputation, quite a negative reputation, because of their strict separation from society. and the way in which they were alleged to treat ex-members. And so this blew up into a huge controversy in a way in which more progressive political parties were able to attack the incumbent government and saying, you're meeting with this secretive right-wing sect. And so it blew up. And around that same time, a bit later, we had an independent politician named Nick Xenophon, who is well known internationally as sort of the scourge of Scientology. And he decided, along with a large media organisation, to start sort of going after Scientology in Parliament. And he gave a famous speech, which sort of was seen as setting off the sort of more contemporary controversies over Scientology. And he wanted to have a full another Royal Commission investigation into Scientology. And then he found very little support from the two major political parties. But the Australian Greens, who are normally a very progressive kind of party, jumped on board because they're like, we want an inquiry into Scientology, but we want the Brethren investigated as well, because the Brethren's campaign funding had been directly aimed at keeping the Greens out of power in marginal electorates. So it became very politicised for about a 10-year period. And so the kind of doomsday fears of the previous decade was overtaken by this kind of infiltration narrative.
Do you have any other updates on cult controversies in Australia after the 2000s, and are any new cult controversies on the horizon at the present time?
I suspect the one that is on the horizon, and I could here give a plug to Angela Coco's paper in this special issue of Nova Religio, may involve the group Universal Medicine. For about 7 or 8 years now, Universal Medicine have been getting a lot of negative press. They're based in sort of the Northern Rivers region, which is a traditionally very alternative region of New South Wales. A lot of alternative medicine, strong heartland of anti-vaccination and these kind of movements. And they've been getting sort of controversial up there. But I think two things that have happened recently. One is COVID-19, which has basically meant that the question of matters of healthcare choice are becoming increasingly politicised, and groups that sort of advocate for various sort of alternative remedies or this kind of things are becoming increasingly under the sort of scrutiny of the media and wider society. And I expect there have already been investigations into Universal Medicine and concerns about their connections with local healthcare practitioners, mainstream and alternative. And I suspect that that's only going to get more heated in the next few years. The other controversy with them involves the leader, Serge Ben Hyan, and his behaviour with women. This has been argued in court and sort of discussed in a lot of these documentaries. I don't know what has happened either way, but he is suspected of some malfeasance there. And I suspect with sort of the rise of the Me Too movement in the last few years and this kind of greater concern of sort of men abusing positions of power, I think he is kind of this one leader that will very much be seen as possibly sort of a target in that sort of region. It's a bit of watch this space on Universal Medicine. And that's also travelled overseas to the United Kingdom as well. So it'd be interesting to see how different systems deal with that, because the NHS in the United Kingdom is a lot more tolerant and open to alternative medicine than is the case in Australia.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. What drew you to studying new religious movements in Australia and elsewhere?
I kind of landed in studying new religions a bit by accident. I'm an ancient historian by training, and I wrote my PhD on a small Phrygian sect or group of Christians in Asia Minor in the 2nd century, the Montanists, as they became known. So an early millenarian group. And so I became interested in I was more interested in heresy than I was in sort of mainstream Orthodox early Christianity in my studies. I always found them just more intriguing, and particularly the way in which they were spoken about by outsiders, and this way in which accusations, these long treatises could be written about how wicked these groups were. And I thought this is really interesting because we still see this today. And so I had an interest in that kind of thing, but I ended up doing my postdoc at Baylor in the US, and I ended up working with Gordon Melton and Philip Jenkins. And I say that Gordon Melton was a bad influence on me, but that was I was willing to be corrupted there. And so he got me very interested in sort of that kind of thing, and just having someone like that down the corridor that you could just talk about you could sort of mention a group and he'd be able to give you the walking encyclopedia of it. And he's like, oh yes, I know about that group. They're different to this group. And so yeah, that was quite encouraging. And I started looking during that time at a few controversies I'd sort of seen boiling over the early 2000s as I was doing my own studies, and thought, you know what, no one's really done a serious academic analysis of this. And so I started off looking at some of the Scientology stuff and the Plymouth Brethren, and it kind of blew out of proportion from there. I just kept looking at different kind of stuff and going. And as a historian, I started looking at archives in particular. And Australia has a fantastic thing called the Archives Act of 1983, which means that intelligence files, even if they're redacted, have to be released after 30 years. So I was able to look at, for instance, the intelligence files that informed government decisions about Scientology going back to the 1950s and analyze them. And very little of it was redacted. Whoever had been doing the redaction did a really lazy job, which I'm very thankful for. And I'd like to put a shout out to that person at the National Archives. Like, keep doing a lazy job and don't censor stuff. And so I was able to sort of unravel some of the background of these stories and discover, you know what, this is what the group thought was happening. This is what wider society thought was happening. Here's what was actually happening behind the scenes. And it was actually far less dramatic, but quite amusing, because it shows how when groups think they're being persecuted and act like they're being persecuted, they tend to bring about the eventuality of that actually happening. So yeah, that's how I ended up in New Religions.
That's fascinating. Great. Well, we're glad to have you here in this field. Have you been surprised by anything that you have found in your research on your religious movements in Australia?
I think there's been three things that have really kind of sprang to mind with this question. The first was Australia's sort of quite pioneering role in the anti-cult movement that had not been picked up on. The first ever anti-cult group in the world, I would argue, actually originated in Australia. And it was probably a committee of about 5 people, 3 of whom were probably a bit, for want of a better term, were crackpots. And they were called the Committee for Mental Health and National Security, which is suggestive of, it's kind of a combination of a John Birch Society kind of anti-communist group and but they introduced the whole idea of secular idea of brainwashing, working on William Sargent's thing. And so I was really surprised that Australia had this history and that no one had picked up on this or documented it. There was a few allusions, like the name of the main person is written in early books on Scientology, but no one had delved out and done a bit wider research and realized that all these periodicals, and I work at a really interesting place because St. Mark's National Theological Centre is on the edge of what's known as a parliamentary triangle in Canberra. So the National Library of Australia is about 500 metres down the road one way, and the National Archives of Australia is 500 metres the other way. So I had the time of actually being able to spend sort of afternoons going through documents in the National Library and old newspapers and pulling out old periodicals that hadn't been out of the library in 50 years that sort of outlined what these groups were up to. So that was a really interesting finding, and just sort of delving into just how much documentary material was actually there. And I found more and more. Like, I went down to Melbourne and found some more, and I'll come back to some of that. The other one was a more recent one I discovered, is that Australia has like its first cult buster in 1850. And this figure called Reverend Henry Hussey. And Henry Hussey was actually, he started off as an evangelical Anglican and then went over and joined the Disciples of Christ in the US, came back with some quite strong millenarian beliefs, and decided he had to be the one-man sort of watchdog of church orthodoxy in South Australia. Now, the thing about the colony of South Australia was that it's historically been called Paradise of Dissent. It was actually where a lot of smaller Protestant groups settled in Australia from sort of continental Europe and the UK. And so it always was a far more tolerant religious environment than other colonies in Australia. But he set himself up as kind of the watchdog of orthodoxy. And so in the 1850s, he's publishing this newspaper called The Christian Advocate. And it could be lifted straight out of a counter-cult pamphlet in a modern-day evangelical bookstore. And it's amazing, he's going after the Swedenborgians, the Unitarians, various British Israelite groups. And he's also going after sort of Tractarians in the Anglican Church and the local papists. And he basically just goes after everyone. And it's fascinating because he became a major figure in the colony. He was like the secretary to the premier, the sort of governor of the colony. Like, this is sort of quite a serious figure. So I've been looking more into sort of his career and the kind of history of Christian antagonism towards alternative spiritualities. And new religions, which is sort of has a deeper history in Australia and kind of ties in with sort of sectarian struggles in Australian history more widely. The third one that was most surprising is a group called the Action Group for Religious Liberty, which I talk about briefly in this article. Now, this group was sort of founded in Melbourne in the mid-1980s, and it's like this grassroots interfaith initiative with Hare Krishnas, Unificationists, Scientologists, and then members of the mainstream churches. There's a couple of Church of England ministers approved to do it by their bishop. You've got a Jesuit priest who they all meet at the Jesuit Theological College. You've got Uniting Church minister who's the chaplain at Melbourne University. And you've also got the official chaplain for the Grand Lodge of Victoria of the Freemasons, who's also an Anglican minister. And this group kind of meet together on a monthly basis for about a 10-year period to sort of address any controversies coming in with new religions, and then write to the newspapers correcting misinformation and this kind of thing. They're kind of the early people to say, you know what, like this satanic panic stuff we're saying in the newspapers is nonsense. And they're saying this in the late 1980s, well before it even reaches its peak in Australia. So they're quite groundbreaking, but also just the way in which there's this fellowship going on between groups. Later on, you have members of the Wiccan community join it, particularly during the Satanic Panic. They realised we're being sort of tarred with this brush as like evil devil worshippers meeting in forests. And so they founded their own groups, but they also linked up with this. And it's just interesting to see this interfaith sort of coalition going on. A lot's been written about the multi-faith and interfaith sort of community in Australia, but there's always tended to be, I've found in scholarship and just generally in interfaith things, that there's kind of like, there's only so far you can go in interfaith. It's the kind of big five world religions, and anything outside that is slightly dubious, particularly. But this is going on before a lot of this stuff, and it's actually continued on in Melbourne. So when I discovered some of this stuff, and the story of that's interesting in itself, I talked to some of the Scientologists in Melbourne, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm on like the local council's interfaith council and this kind of thing. And there's still this grassroots stuff going on that you just don't hear about. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a history to be written of this group in particular, and unfortunately they wound up in the early 1990s. But yeah, there's boxes full of basically all the minutes for their meetings going back 10 years, and all kinds of material, letters they wrote to the media and Parliament are all contained in the archives of a dead Jesuit priest. And no one had looked at it. I spoke to the archivist there, and he's like, you can come visit while you're in Melbourne, but I don't think you'll find anything. And then I arrived on the day, and he's like, I may have misinformed you. There's 6 boxes of material here. Mm-hmm. And so on 2 days, I rushed through copying as much as possible. And there's just, there's this amazing stuff and it's untapped resources.
Yes. That does sound like a remarkable effort. So their concern was to gather accurate information about new religious movements.
Very much. And also to sort of advocate for, they had a broad sort of ambit of religious freedom. And so whenever sort of a group was sort of looked at, they'd sort of analyse the group and sort of discuss the issues at their meetings. So for instance, they discussed the family in Victoria, the Anne Hamilton Byrne group, and decided not to make any representations there because they felt there was something very amiss. Mm-hmm. And they had experts come in talking about LSD use in religion and this kind of thing. And they had academic experts in various groups come up. Jim Richardson spoke to them at one of their later meetings when he was over in Australia. Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine who's actually a leading biblical scholar spoke at one of the meetings. And so I bailed him up and asked him about it. And he was like, oh yes, that was a long time ago. And before I knew about brainwashing and sort of disowned sort of thing, I'm like, oh, I was going to compliment you on that. But if you want to sort of go that way. Mm-hmm. So.
That sounds fascinating. I'm glad you obtained access to those documents. That's wonderful. What are some of the big picture conclusions that you have drawn from your study of new religious movements?
I think the one thing that really stands out is Australia's controversies very much tend to mirror those overseas, but they don't tend to assume the same proportions as overseas and get to the same level of sort of extremity. And I think this has a lot to do with something generally observed, that Australia's attitude towards religion is generally not as heated as the US. It was one of our early ministers and sort of in Australia referred to Australia as the most godless place under heaven. And while that's very much sort of a canard people take, it is a very secular country, and there tends to be, even within the mainline churches, a lot of live and let live tolerance. and kind of these kind of things just don't blow out of proportion. And so in Australia, like generally, even the most unpopular new religions, and here I'd say the Church of Scientology is normally pretty top of the list as far as new religions go, have been able to kind of carve out for themselves a sort of space in Australia with a fair degree of tolerance. They get the media sort of make fun of them and this kind of thing, but it doesn't sort of, these controversies kind of suggest that it flares up now and then, but it's not actually a kind of normative state and this kind of thing, that generally new religions have done quite well in Australia. What I also found though is that there's just so much material to really go through, and I think this is something I really want to end the article on, was basically saying like, I need some research. Unfortunately, I work in the School of Theology, and theologians are suspicious enough that I teach a course on new religions and worry about my orthodoxy. As it is, they're not likely to do a project on sort of a group or do an honours thesis. But there's just so much material that sort of needs to be gone through, and projects sort of that are just waiting to be done. And so, I mean, this article, I'd like to turn into a wider book, because I think there's a history to be written there. But I think it's sort of, there's a real opportunity, I think, for younger scholars. And I know particularly at the University of Sydney and Western Sydney University, they're producing a lot of great honours and PhD students working more and more on new religious topics. So I'm just hoping one of them can get a postdoc somewhere and be able to like spend some time really delving into some of these things. So
great.
Hopefully.
Well, and I hope you do write your book, so that's be wonderful. And you've already touched on this, but please tell us about the projects you're currently working on. So do you have anything else you'd like to share?
I've got a couple of things. So I've just finished an article which deals initially with the Australian Christian responses to new religions going back to the 1850s. And this was sort of originally, I gave as a guest lecture launching a friend of mine, a Latter-day Saint lawyer's book. And so I thought this is an interesting sort of thing. So I've just got that coming out later this year in Lucas, which is a small Australian journal. It'll be online of the Evangelical History Association, because most of the people involved were evangelical churchmen who didn't like cults, or particularly didn't like other forms of Christianity, which they felt diverged from their own beliefs. And I've also just sort of working on a chapter on the history of the study of new religions in Australia, and basically just mapping where it's come from and where it's sort of heading, going back to sort of the earliest stuff written is basically counter-cult pamphlet literature that starts to appear in the 1850s, but sort of shots up particularly, and a lot of pamphlets against spiritualism, theosophy over the late 19th century into the 20th, and then sort of shifts in the 1950s. You have a sort of shift happens with one particular writer, goes from writing anti-Freemason and anti-spiritualism pamphlets to attacking Scientology on the radio, and that kind of maps and how this thing's shifted. So, and then scholars start to take a look in the late 60s and go, oh, maybe these groups are worth us studying seriously as religions. And so sort of tracing that sort of history. And I've just been publishing a bit on, my hobby interest is religion and popular culture. So I've just been publishing on Roman Catholicism, Vatican II, and Catholic horror films, with something that I just published. And so just some sort of more fun, sort of silly projects, I'd call them, sort of where you're just doing something a bit less sort of serious, I'd say.
Oh, no, there are people who take that seriously, I'm sure.
Oh, no, I find it fascinating, but I feel I always have to justify my interests here. My class at Charles Sturt University is referred to by my colleagues as the Weirdos course, or the DIY religion course. So I've managed to get the words cults and sects out of the title of the course, but I spend the first half of the course sort of telling students, you know what, like there is no tick box definition of a cult, and can you please stop referring to every group that you look at in this group as a cult? And it's just there. So
yeah, I know that's challenging even with my students. I know the challenge. So, well, and when I introduced you, I should have mentioned that you're the guest editor of the special issue on new religious movements in Australia in the August issue of August 2020 issue of Nova Religio. So we're very grateful that you were the guest editor of this very fascinating special issue. And also thank you for your very, masterful overview of the cult controversies up until the year 2000. But it sounds like you have a lot more work to do, and I'm happy that you're in the process of doing it. So that's wonderful.
There is much more to be done. And so American research students, if any of you are interested in Australia, please get in touch. there is work to be done in the Southern Hemisphere.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thanks, Kathy.